Hello, everyone, and welcome to another panel from this year's podcast festival, Listen Up, the Power of Podcasting, organized by the Association of European Journalists in Bulgaria. I'm Peter, and I will be your host for the next hour as we talk to three exceptional journalists about the rise of news podcasts. A few housekeeping tips before we begin. As with the previous talk with Gregory, please use the Q&A section to send your questions, and the panelists will have a chance to answer them towards the end of the conversation. And for those of you who need translation in Bulgarian, please click interpretation in the meeting menu and select the Bulgarian channel. Also, use the hashtag ListenUp and the hashtag Podcast Festival on social media if you want to share your opinion on how we're doing and the discussion. So, on the panel today, we have Katy Lee, co-host of the Europeans podcast. Hello, Katy.
Hi, really nice to be here.
Hey. We also have Andrew Gray, EU editor at Politico Europe and host of their weekly podcast, EU Confidential. Hello, Andrew.
Hey there.
And finally, we have Zornitsa Stoilova from one of Bulgaria's leading newspapers, Capital Weekly. She hosts their weekly show, The Voice of Capital. Hello, Zornitsa.
Hi.
Hey, so in recent years, podcasting has radically changed the way that we consume news. And with that in mind, we're going to talk about the successes and challenges news podcasts face today and explore different approaches newsrooms can take to better serve their audiences. First, let me start with a question for all of you. News podcasts have come to play a major role in our everyday life as we try to stay informed about local and international events. Many people choose this format over print and television news. And in your opinion, what makes news podcasts so appealing to audiences, and why do people listen to your show specifically? And Katy, let's start with you, if that's okay.
Yeah, so with our podcast, The Europeans, I think it's managed to build an audience because it fills a gap in the market. In that, before we started it back in 2017, there were a couple of podcasts about Europe, but they were very much for people within the Brussels bubble. And what we wanted to do was make a podcast that didn't feel like a traditional news podcast or didn't feel like radio. We wanted it to feel like a conversation between friends that you were just listening to at home or on the train. And I think that's why people like it. Obviously, it is serious, it is very well researched, but it has a very informal tone. Me and my co-host have been friends for a very long time, more than 10 years. And I think that really shows in our relationship. We don't take it too seriously. So I think that's probably it. The other thing that's interesting is that a lot of Americans listen to our podcast, which is something that surprised us. We made this podcast for people that live here, but a surprising number of Americans listen to it because they just don't get to hear that much about Europe in their own national news media. So that's quite interesting. I guess in answer to your first question, Peter, about why people choose this format over print and television, I have a very boring answer, which is it's transport, right? I mean, people want something to do to keep them busy while they are on the train or on the bus to work. Obviously, that has been less of a issue this year with many people working from home. But I think that's definitely why we've seen such a massive rise over the last few years. It's people who are listening on their way to work and home.
Excellent. And Andrew, what about you? What do you think makes news podcasts so appealing, and why do people tune into your show specifically?
I mean, I think as Katy says, commuting has played a big part of it, particularly also because you can actually download a podcast. So even if you're, in the London Underground or somewhere where you don't have great signal, you can still listen to podcasts when you can't, use the internet or do, other things that you might do on your, your mobile phone or your tablet or whatever. So I think that's certainly part of it. I also think we spend so much time looking at screens now. Certainly, I find that I just don't want to look at a screen after a certain point. And so there's a lot to be said for just giving your eyes a rest and listening to something. I think, one of the things about podcasts, that informal tone that Katy talks about, is also just really appealing to people. I think, some of the traditional ways of news presentation look a bit old-fashioned now and sound a bit old-fashioned, this very kind of formal approach. And I think people enjoy that more informal style. another example of it would be Brexit Cast, which was a kind of breakout hit with really just, a bunch of journalists talking about the news. There's nothing very, there's nothing very high tech about that, but it works very well. And, a lot of that just comes down to the content and the knowledge that those, individual presenters are bringing to that show. And I would say that's the same with ours. I mean, I think a lot of podcasts have a community, right? They either build a community or they're trying to serve a particular community. And in our case, obviously, unlike Katy's podcast, ours is very much partly for the Brussels bubble. There are a lot of people who kind of eat, sleep, breathe EU politics. Political Europe aims to serve them. And so a lot of them, like to have their news now or like to listen to podcasts. So we wanted to be very much, in that space, if you like. But we also want to kind of demystify and make the European Union and how it works accessible to a broader audience across Europe. And so that's our secondary audience, if you like, but also very important to us. And like Katy, we have a lot of listeners in the US, I think, who want to understand more about the EU specifically and how it works. And so we aim to do that as well. So I think, as I say, we have these kind of two audiences, a kind of inner circle, if you like, but we also want it to be accessible to this outer circle as well.
Yeah, interesting. I completely agree with that. And if we turn our attention to Bulgaria for a second, Zornitsa, podcasts are relatively new in terms of, like the format for Bulgaria. What do you think makes Bulgarians listen to podcasts? And again, what about your show specifically? What have you found about your audience?
Sorry, I apologize. I really thought that I was unmuted. I'm sorry. So I think with the world in Bulgaria in particular, so confusing and information overflowing, people are often missing the big picture and are yearning for deeper understanding. And I personally see the rise of podcasting as a way to slow down. Of this whole movement of slowing down, of, trying to carefully select what comes into your daily life and into your home now in 2020. And I don't know, I connected with the search for more meaningful conversation. Personally, for me, I figured that I want to go into podcasting as a media professional or during my maternity leave, because while I was at home with my baby, I needed a hands-free medium, and I was listening to a lot of audiobooks and podcasts, and that was my main platform to consume information and entertainment. And I couldn't keep up with the current news cycle. I didn't want to be honest. And I noticed how deep and engaging this medium can be, and that I can learn so much more this way. And when I was offered to lead Capital's audio projects, I really could put that into perspective. I mean, in the weekly show that I'm hosting, The Voice of Capital, I think it really showcases this idea, because each week we choose to focus on just one important story of the week, and in 20 minutes we try to dive deeper into it and to provide our listeners with background information, with context, with analysis, so that they can form their own opinion, basically. And sometimes we choose a topic that is popular and that everyone talks about. Sometimes we want to highlight something that we have worked on, which our journalists have done extensive research or investigation about it. And I think basically in Bulgaria, this is our legacy as a media, to try to explain why something is happening, to provide a context, a meaning in the whole chaos, and so that our readers or listeners can make informed decisions about their lives and their businesses.
Mm-hmm. And Andrew, what inspired you to start a podcast at Politico? I mean, what inspired Politico to start a podcast?
It was, I mean, I guess I wouldn't say we're quite jumping on the bandwagon, but we could see that that was obviously an expanding area. And there were a few of us who were already kind of big podcast fans within the organization. Some of us also with some radio experience. I have some of that. It's so long ago, though, that I was using a white pencil to cut tape when I was editing radio, that most of you won't have any idea what that is. But that's how far back I go in radio, and I hadn't done it for a long time, but I'd always missed it. So I was very keen for us to be kind of involved in audio. And our original host, Ryan Heath, who also was the original author of the Brussels Playbook, the newsletter, was also very keen to do something. So it was partly, you know, just an enthusiasm among the team, but also a realization that this was, you know, a growing platform. It was a new market, it was an expanding market, and we wanted to be there. So a combination of those two things. And I think you'll find that actually again and again that, you know, there's a big, just about everybody who's doing podcasts is doing them because they really enjoy doing it. You know, whether they're doing it for a living or a hobby or something in between. And so there was definitely a big part of that. It's always been a kind of passion project with us, and the various spin-off podcasts that we've done, you know, would be in the same category.
Katy, on your show, you discuss politics and culture with your co-host Dominic, but you have a different approach, I would say, in contrast to most news shows. You like to explain complex issues through human-centered stories. And I remember one time Dominic went to a bar in Budapest to talk to locals about Viktor Orban. So my question is, why did you choose this informal approach, and how do you find interesting people to report on around Europe?
Yeah, I mean, I guess part of it was just that we wanted to make a podcast that was for people like us, really. It was the podcast that we were surprised didn't exist in the world, and it kind of felt like, oh, no one's doing it. I guess we might as well do it. I guess specifically for us as two British people living on continental Europe, our podcast grew out of Brexit to some extent, in that both of us felt quite frustrated with the way that Europe and the European Union had often been portrayed in the British media. It was always something that was very abstract and remote from your lives, and it's just basically a bunch of old white men in suits who are making decisions that you're probably not going to be able to understand. So for us, it was really important to take that informal approach and kind of try to demystify Europe in a way that felt really accessible and approachable. And the idea really was that we were people like our listeners to some extent, which is that we are Brussels bubble outsiders who feel guilty that we don't know more about what's happening in our backyard. Especially as Brits, we often felt like we knew way more about American politics than politics in neighboring countries. So the Europeans, to some extent, our own sort of voyage of discovery, if you like. It's us also learning and trying to understand more about neighboring countries. In terms of how we find interesting people to report on, a lot of it is just reacting to the news of the past week or the past 2 or 3 weeks. Perhaps, you know, there might have been some interesting development in Poland or wherever it is. So we will try to find somebody who is involved in the story and talk to them. But increasingly, we get guest ideas from our own listeners. People often email us saying, hello, I'm in this country. You might not have heard about this person, but they're doing really great work and you might want to talk to them. And that's something that we really encourage. We like this idea of having, as Andrew says, a community around our podcast and feeling like it is a little club almost, and that people can really get involved if they want to in helping to shape the show itself.
Yeah, I think this connection with listeners is quite important, obviously, and I think it's very beneficial. On the topic of understanding, you know, the continent, Andrew, Politico is famous for its hard news coverage, and the world and Europe is such a difficult place to understand right now. For Europe specifically, this year has been quite challenging with COVID, with Brexit, and with protests in many countries, including Bulgaria. How do you manage to break down all of these events and keep your listeners informed without overwhelming them?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it comes down again to that conversational style. And I think that the thing that we're very fortunate to have is a big, you know, newsroom, which I can't remember how many nationalities and languages we have. I think we're into the 20s in terms of how many different languages are spoken. I think it's about 25, 26. So we have a newsroom of about, you know, more than 70 journalists who come from across Europe, who cover a lot of different topics in great depth, including healthcare, for example, which has obviously come to the fore this year. And then we have people who may cover a particular topic, but are also specialists in a particular country because they've, lived there or they're from there. And so we're able to draw on this newsroom and really pick a topic, whatever might be the topic of the week or the topic of the moment, and normally find people within the newsroom who are, very well versed in that topic. And then I think the next stage in terms of, to your point on not overwhelming people, is to try and do it in that conversational style. So very much as if you kind of were meeting with friends, or you're overhearing a conversation in, a bar or a cafe between friends. And so to keep that kind of informal tone, not to be scared to ask the very basic questions, and just let the expertise of the people you're talking to come out in the course of the conversation. So I think that's been a big advantage for us this year, is to be able to kind of draw on that newsroom. And that's something we've tried to do more and more in the podcast, is just, draw on the expertise of the people we have, even if they're not physically with us in the newsroom, which sometimes is a bit of a challenge. But, we normally have somebody on the end of a Zoom connection who can help us out.
Zornitsa, I think we can say the same about the style of your podcast. It's quite conversational, but it's also very interesting and informative, obviously. So I'm interested in, how does your podcast complement your print coverage? Because you talked about the legacy of your media. So how do these two things work together?
They work very well, actually. I mean, through the podcast, we are actually sharing the best journalism that we've produced in the print edition or in the online edition this week. And we do what Politico does, basically. I mean, we try to showcase our journalists' expertise and knowledge in specific industries or topics. And I think the two platforms, podcasting and online and print edition, really complement each other, because in the podcast, we always mention if you want to dig deeper in the story, you can find more online, or in print, you can find more interviews, more timelines, graphics, etc. And I mean, in 2020, we are not a newspaper anymore. I mean, we are a media platform that have different distribution channels. And all that being said, we continue to experiment with our format, and actually now we are trying to include more voices outside of our organization, like interview business leaders and economists and analysts on different topics. We also try to do special episodes like audio features and narrative series on specific topics, where we try to tell the story from multiple angles and viewpoints. And the most recent example I can give is with an episode about Bulgarians coming back to Bulgaria because of the pandemic, and what can we do to make them stay, because that Bulgaria is a classic example of a brain drain country, and we lack professionals in critical areas. So we really tried to look professionals who have come back to Bulgaria because of a reason related to the coronavirus, and ask them what brought them back, then if we can do anything to make them stay.
And you're probably the first large media with an audio team. And you also have two other podcasts, I think, including one which is targeting children, talking about money. It's an educational show. Can you talk a little bit about that as well?
Well, we are a business media. We are focused. We try to tell, business and economy stories, basically. And we thought that podcasting is a good way to find new audience as well, which we did according to the statistics, actually. And if you want, I can show you one slide about our demographics. It's the Voice of Capital demographics, actually, but just a sec. Did I manage to share my screen?
I don't think so.
I'm sorry.
Can you tell us what's in the graph?
Yep.
It's always do it like it's audio, Zornitsa. Just have to describe it.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry. Well, the majority of our public is of our listeners, according to Spotify, is between the age of group of 28-34, and we also have a large proportion who are 23 to 27 years old, or even 18 to 22. So that's a bit different from our online demographics and from our print edition demographics. So that means that we've started talking to new people, which is great. And that's why we decided to do this educational podcast that is called Kids and Money. And yeah, it basically, we invited young people from 9 to 18 years old to ask their questions about the different topics connected with money, such as, I don't know, how can I make a business? How can I start a budget? How do banks work? And they, fill the shoes of a journalist in one episode and ask a business leader from the country those questions. And we actually challenged the business leaders of our country to, explain to children what they do.
Interesting.
And it was a huge hit. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think many shows do this. I don't want to talk too much about the pandemic, but it's kind of difficult not to talk about it. Katy, many people have found this year quite depressing and have chosen to stay away from any news coverage, including myself, I must admit, in some periods. Have you noticed anything like this with your audience? And do you benefit from the fact that you take a more informal approach on your show?
Yeah, I think we do. We were expecting to see a massive drop because, both my co-host and me personally, we were listening to fewer news podcasts ourselves. Neither of us were really traveling to work anymore. And it was just, there was such fatigue and, it was really nice to get away from the news. So if I was listening to anything personally, I was often listening to comedy or things that were really completely unrelated to the news. So yeah, it was surprising to us that we didn't see a big drop or really any drop at all. We've seen a boost, if anything, in our listenership over the past few months. And I think that is partly because we took this very clear policy to say, okay, we're not going to talk about coronavirus on this podcast. You can hear about that anywhere else. We're going to have a sort of a ban on the C word, as we called it. Previously, we banned Brexit talk. That was the B word, because similarly, you could hear about that anywhere else. And we decided, okay, let's do this with coronavirus. We will talk about the news. We will talk about serious topics, but we will talk about the things that probably aren't getting as much attention as they would normally because of everything that's happening with the pandemic. And I think people have really liked that approach to some extent. The other thing that we do that people have always liked, it's always been a very popular segment, is Dominic likes to end every week's episode with a positive story, a happy ending. And that has definitely done a lot to cheer people up. So it's often something very silly. It involves animals and people finding weird things with metal detectors on the beach. It's just something to make people smile. And I think people have really enjoyed that over the past few months.
And Andrew, what about you? How do you deal with this situation, and how did the pandemic, impact your workflow and the way you sort of approach the show?
Yeah, well, we kind of went in the opposite direction, really, in that we felt, we were also worried about audience. I really thought, a lot of our audience is commuting, particularly, people commuting in and out of the Brussels bubble. As we know, there's a lot of moving around within the EU between Brussels and Strasbourg, people going back to their home countries from Brussels every weekend or every Thursday afternoon or evening or whatever. And then, of course, you also have an audience that, listens in the gym, that kind of thing. And of course, all of that kind of disappeared, as we know, almost overnight. But we also were pleasantly surprised to see that people still found time to listen and seemed to listen in even greater numbers. But we did feel that there was an opportunity, that this was such a massive story, a kind of all-encompassing story, that it was going to dominate the regular podcast if we just talked about coronavirus every week. So what we did was an extra program, which we put out on a Monday, normally kind of late Monday afternoon or Monday evening, which was very much focused on that. And again, we were fortunate because we have an in-house team who cover health and who cover health at EU level. So suddenly that became incredibly relevant. And I think one advantage of the pandemic for podcasters is that there's a lot of people stuck at home, and you can get them on a Zoom call and talk to them. And that includes experts, so epidemiologists, virologists, people who are health policy experts. So during the first lockdown, we did these extra podcasts. So we went from one show a week to 2 shows a week, with one which was really coronavirus focused. And I think then that allowed people to choose. If you want a dose of coronavirus, but done in the way that we do it, it was there for you. If you wanted a more, more mixed program, we were going to do that for you as well. So we did stop after the first lockdown. It was a huge challenge. I mean, I have many other hats to wear, as well as kind of podcast overseer and co-host. And so everything takes longer when you're trying to do it from home and you're not all in the newsroom together. But it seemed worthwhile. And I think people certainly the feedback was positive, and people enjoyed that and got into the rhythm of twice a week. The people who wanted to have something extra, maybe because they had more time they were looking to fill, they had 2 podcasts a week instead of 1.
Yeah, and I think in these times, probably people realize more and more the value of good journalism, because it's, so many things are happening. We live in a crisis. And this leads me to the question, how can journalists and media organizations around the world sort of improve their audio storytelling to better serve their audiences? Katy?
To unmute myself, sorry. Yeah, really good question. I guess one of the things that is kind of noticeable is that a lot of people have moved from print into making podcasts, news podcasts. Obviously, newsrooms are dominated by hard news journalists. So a lot of us are print people who have sort of made our way into audio. And I think we could probably be a bit more imaginative en masse, all of us. I think we could push the boundaries a bit more. There was a lot of creative people working in the audio industry, but they don't necessarily work in news podcasts. But the potential is there to do hugely creative things with audio and really play with sound and create these sort of immersive experiences for people. It seems like there's a lot of untapped potential there. I'm thinking a little bit about podcasts like, I don't know if any of you have heard the podcast Have You Heard George's Podcast? It won a bunch of prizes over the last few years, including for Best Current Affairs Podcast. And yet it doesn't feel like a current affairs podcast because the format is so groundbreaking and creative, and it incorporates spoken word and fiction and all of these different things. And yet it is a current affairs podcast. It talks about the criminal justice system and racism in Britain. It talks about lots of different things. Now, I'm not suggesting that every newsroom should try and make like a spoken word podcast and do all of these crazy things. But I do think we could be a little bit less stiff, and that we could exploit all of that creativity that exists in the audio industry at large.
And Andrew, what about you? How do you think what more can you do to better serve your audience?
Yeah, I mean, I think we are restricted in one way at the moment because of the pandemic. I think we would be getting out of the Brussels bubble and getting out of the political world much more if we could. I would love to we did something online which we didn't really just have the time or resources to kind of replicate in the podcast. But I certainly felt that obviously one of the dangers of this pandemic is that we all retreat into our own bubbles, right? The communities that we have, the friends that we have, and that's great. But again, it just all kind of accentuates this problem, which we know is a problem with, the rise of social media, of kind of living in an echo chamber. And one of the things I felt was that we were kind of almost retreating into that. It's very hard to do the classic journalistic thing of just getting out there and trying to kind of get beyond the bubble. And so we did an online thing where we spoke to mayors or local leaders in communities of all 28 European countries, in other words, the EU 27 plus the UK, a range of, countryside, small towns, provincial towns. And I would have loved to have done something similar like that in a kind of audio form. And, we put all this together online and asked them all the same sort of questions so you could compare between countries and communities, just what they were dealing with the coronavirus. So I would just, I think we can obviously find creative ways to still do that, but obviously it takes a lot longer. But I think as soon as this is over, or as soon as things are relaxed a bit, what I would just love us to do more of is kind of getting out there beyond these kind of political bubbles and trying to kind of feed back into them, what people are saying about, what they're experiencing at the moment.
Yeah, hopefully we're going to have that chance. I mean, around the world, and like most newsrooms are going to have that chance. But I want to go back to Zornitsa with the same question, because I know that in Bulgaria, the media situation is different, and most news organizations function with limited resources. But again, what would you do in terms of your audio storytelling to improve your coverage and, again, better serve your audience here in Bulgaria?
I would love to do more field reporting as well and more human-centered stories. I love what Katy and Dominic are doing with often inviting their guests by recommendation from listeners, and I think that's awesome. And I think actively seeking feedback and nurturing relationships with the audience is something that we would like to pursue as well.
And what have you learned, all of you, since you started the podcast? I know it's a very general question, but what are the most important lessons? Katy, first.
I guess the main takeaway is a huge amount of work, especially if you're not doing it with the support of a large news organization. I mean, ours is still, people often say, oh, where's your studio? And my studio is my bedroom, and Dominic's studio is underneath his stairs. It's really, it's a lot of work to do, especially as an independent passion project. Not that we don't love doing it. We wouldn't still be doing it if we didn't love doing it. But it is a huge amount of work. And even if you are part of a large news organization, it's a lot of work, the consistency, churning out an episode week after week or day after day in some cases. It is a lot of work, and building that community and keeping that community, especially as things get more competitive and there are more and more things competing for the attention of people's ears. I guess the other big thing I've learned is that people have a more personal relationship, perhaps, with their favorite podcast hosts than they might do with a radio station. And we often get these really nice messages from people saying, oh, it feels like we're friends. And that's really, really nice, actually, and something that I really wasn't expecting.
And
Andrew, what about you? What did you learn?
Yeah, I think we've learned a lot. We also started, even though I would say we're kind of medium-sized news organization, and we don't have a studio, and we started with some pretty basic equipment, and in some ways actually we had some pretty basic equipment and we had some fancier equipment, and that was actually a mistake, because you don't really want kind of studio quality microphones if you don't have a studio, because it's just going to pick up too much noise that you actually don't want people to hear. So there were some technical things, a lot of technical things we've kind of learned on the way. But I think one thing that I think people don't realize, I completely agree with Katy, is, the two things are, it's harder than it looks and it takes a lot longer than you think. But I also think that sometimes people think, partly because a lot of podcasts have that kind of informal style, that it's almost just like you sit down and, talk for half an hour, maybe you play in some clips, and that's about it. And the bottom line, I think one of the things we've really learned is, this is still journalism, and the things that make journalism good are the things that make a podcast good. And that means, thinking about it a lot before you start what you're doing. It means going through a kind of editorial process of, a first draft, working with that, editing it down, checking that what you've got there is accurate, going through another round of editing. So all of the things that and finding the right people to talk to. So in other words, all the things that go into making, a good kind of journalistic product, whether it's a story or a TV documentary or anything, apply to podcasts, even though they sound, there's a lot of work sometimes goes into making something sound like not a lot of work went into it. And I think that's the thing that we've really learned, that even though this is the tone may be different, the style may be different, it's still a journalistic product, and it still benefits from the kind of rigor that goes into just about any journalistic product. Doesn't mean that it shouldn't be fun to make or shouldn't be fun to listen to, and in both cases definitely should, but there's a lot of work that has to go into that, including just good old-fashioned journalistic thought. One thing, just picking up on what we talked about earlier, and Zornitsa mentioned the kind of relationship between the podcast and the rest of what, for example, we do at Politico. We have obviously, we're mainly a digital news service, digital publication, and we also have a print newspaper. I think when podcasts work really well for us, sometimes there's a kind of virtuous cycle. So something that will come up in the podcast discussion may then lead to a story. So one of the things, the format of our podcast is generally to have our Paris correspondent, our Berlin correspondent, myself, and somebody else, most often from the Brussels newsroom, as a kind of weekly panel, and to have a discussion about, some of the big topics of the week. And sometimes, and the idea behind that is obviously that's how the EU works, right? It's partly feeding in from other places, and it's partly what happens here in Brussels. And one of the things that's been interesting is sometimes those discussions have led to story ideas that have then become online stories, that we've published. And sometimes, we might see a piece that's been published and think we could do something there for audio, or this is someone who's already been covered in a story or mentioned in a story, but they would be a good interviewee for us. So I think that's one of the things we've also learned, is that there can be good, synergies within the whole organization from doing podcasts.
Yeah, and it's so interesting that right now there are so many ways to produce content. And I think in the past few years, we have talked a lot about building a healthy news diet. And we often speak about podcasting and podcasts as, a part of a healthy news diet. But I just want to get your opinion on that. Zornitsa, what does a healthy news diet mean to you personally?
Well, obviously, first, choosing the sources you trust is the most important one. I don't watch news on television, I have to admit. I like to start my day with morning briefings, one or two, New York Times, Politico, one of the Bulgarian ones. I listen to a lot of podcasts, and I try to really make time in my day to a few or one long form pieces whenever I have 15 to 20 minutes. That's what I do.
And Katy, what about you? What advice would you give to the audience in terms of, again, building a healthy news diet?
I think Zornitsa's diet is very admirable, and I wish I was quite so well behaved. I spend way too much time on Twitter, and that would probably be my advice. Spend less time on Twitter. It's a hellhole. It's not that bad. But one thing I do try and do with Twitter, actually, that I don't really do in terms of my other media consumption, is I do try to keep in my timeline voices that I disagree with, because obviously one of the biggest issues over the last few years has been that we find ourselves more and more in echo chambers. So yeah, there are a surprising number of people in my timeline that I disagree with, which doesn't always create the sort of friendliest of atmospheres, but I think it's important that they stay there. I don't want to just be surrounded by voices that I agree with all the time. I think that's probably not too healthy.
Yeah. I want to ask a personal question, which I'm very curious about. So many journalists who are hosting news podcasts previously had literally no experience with any kind of multimedia coverage. And in the beginning, did you find it, if this was the case with you, did you find it difficult to actually speak to an audience instead of just writing? And what was this experience like for you, Andrew?
Yeah, well, as I said, I had done radio, local radio in Scotland a long, long time ago, and I really loved it. But I didn't have a lot of formal training, and it was a long time ago. And I think One of the things that does come with, a lot of this, you hear people talk about this a lot in kind of radio and podcasts and audio, is finding your voice. And, it's the same with writing, right? It's finding a kind of way that works for you to communicate. And that does take some time, I think, even if you've had some experience of doing that, a long time ago. Certainly the formats and things that I was involved in were quite different, and I was much, much, much younger. So I think, thankfully, that does come with practice. There's something very good about the routine of having to do it every week. And I think that really helps. I think one area where it can take a while to develop is, even if you have been a journalist and you have done literally thousands of interviews, if you're doing an interview, which is basically a news gathering interview, right, trying to find out information. Not all interviews are like that. Obviously, if you're a journalist, you might be doing a more featurey interview. But what you're doing with an interview that you might use in a podcast, particularly if you're just going to use that, pretty much an edited down version, it's much more of a conversation. And so, you want to, or I certainly feel like we want to strike a balance between challenging people, holding them to account, challenging their points of view, but doing that in a way that doesn't grate with the listener, doesn't feel too aggressive, and still feels like a conversation, because a good conversation can often involve people challenging each other, right, even if they're friends. And so I think that's a new skill. And again, with a lot of these things, it comes with repetition, right? It comes with doing it again and again. It comes with listening back and thinking, that wasn't very good, don't want to do it that way again. And finding that kind of balance and finding, for example, ways to interject that sound okay when you listen back. And sometimes, of course, you can do that with visual cues. But finding ways to make it more of a conversation so that it's not entirely the interviewee, not too much of the interviewer, of course. It shouldn't really be about the interviewer. But I do think, again, you want it to be that kind of, almost like a group of people that might come to your apartment or your home. And maybe the regular hosts are the people that are friends, and maybe they've brought somebody else along this week who, you're interested to hear what that person has to say. So how do you kind of make that into a conversation that works for everyone? I think that's one of the things that you need to learn as a kind of podcast host or interviewer that's quite different from the interviewing skills that you might have developed, as a print journalist, if you like.
I want to get to some audience questions, but before that, one question which concerns the future of news podcasts. What do you believe are the challenges are going to be the challenges in the future? And could podcasting be a sustainable platform to distribute news? Zornitsa.
Well, I think the challenges ahead of podcasts are not very much different from the challenges news media is facing in general. I mean, to find a sustainable business model is, I think, the most important one. Also, maybe better tools and methods to measure your performance and your audience. And I think in this area, even the platforms that we use to distribute our content are not very detailed and not giving us enough information yet. Also, I would add that it's important for podcasts to stay a place free of fake news and partisanship, and to continue to be a medium that helps listeners understand, make sense of things, and not contributing to closing people in social bubbles and single-mindedness. Yeah, I think I'm optimistic about podcast being a sustainable platform to distribute news, because I think that the mantra that people are not willing to pay for content online is no longer true. And I think that given even the fact that so many podcasts now are out there are making a living through Patreon donations, and I think that this is really gives me hope. And also advertising in podcasting is constantly growing year to year, because I think brands are also realizing that the value of deep conversation, and they want to take a part of it.
Mm-hmm. And Katy, your podcast gets donations on Patreon. And with that in mind, are you optimistic for the future? Do you see this, this is a sustainable business model, and podcasting in general, again, as a sustainable platform to distribute news?
Yeah, I think Zornitsa's totally right. The future is looking pretty okay. I mean, first of all, this whole idea of people not being willing to pay for content has kind of gone away, and we've proven that. People are very nice, and they are willing to support projects that they enjoy and would be sad if they disappeared. So I think things are okay for us personally on that front. And in general, across the industry, if you look at reports of what proportion of the population listens to podcasts, it is just going up and up and up every single year. And that is more or less across the board. Obviously, some countries have a more developed podcast audience than others. Some are growing faster than others. But in general, that is more ears for advertisers to put a message in. And the other thing is that people, there is some evidence to suggest that people respond perhaps more positively to podcast advertising than they do, just like a banner ad that you see on a website. You're more likely to take that message in, particularly because a lot of the time it feels like it's almost like a personal endorsement of the host, right? A product that is advertised on a podcast. So on that front, I think things are pretty good. However, I would also say that the fact that the podcast market is growing means that things are getting more and more competitive for podcast makers themselves, particularly in the news sector. If you think about, just speaking about the English speaking world now, how many large news organizations have tried to launch daily news podcasts over the last few years to compete with the daily from the New York Times. There's a lot of them, and they're all competing for that slice of people's days listening on the tube or on the bus. So things are getting increasingly competitive on that front. I think it's good. I think competition is good, but it does mean it will be harder to get a slice of that pie.
And Andrea, I want to get your perspective on this as well, given that you're a part of a major news organization. What is are you optimistic for the future, and what do you think is going to happen with news podcasts?
Yeah, I'm a bit of both. I agree with Katy that even as listening is growing, I mean, there are an incredible number of podcasts out there. I mean, it does look, every second person's Twitter biography seems to include the fact that they host a podcast. And at some point, there's going to be more people making them than listening to them if things go on at this rate. So, I do think there's going to be a bit of a shakeout at some point. And you can see there's a bit, some of the money that's being paid at the moment for podcast companies. We know that Spotify's gone on this, amazing kind of spending spree, and others have done the same. I mean, you don't have to be an expert economist to say that some of this stuff looks a bit like a bubble, and you wonder, where everything is going to be, if and when it bursts. But I do think this is a medium that people are very attached to, and I don't think that's going to disappear. So even if there is, a bit of a shakeout, I still think people, as Katy says, feel a very personal connection to these podcasts a lot of the time, and I think that's really helpful and will stand us in good stead. The other point, though, is technology benefits podcasts at the moment, but 5G will come along. People will be able to stream videos on their commutes, and that's going to be a new challenge. Suddenly, audio is not going to dominate that space as it probably does at the moment. So I do think there's potential. Sponsorship again is not unproblematic sometimes, because again, when people have this kind of personal connection to the podcast, they feel kind of let down perhaps if they don't like a particular sponsor that might be sponsoring a particular episode. So I think sponsorship is a good option. In some ways, it can bring in a more kind of premium revenue than simple advertising. So that I think does have already is, a big generator of revenue for podcasts. The dynamic advertising that we're seeing with podcast advertising is another route that allows the kind of, micro targeting, obviously not unproblematic from a privacy point of view, but it is a potential, source of revenue. So, I would say the picture is mixed. There are definitely lots of encouraging signs out there, but there are also a few, I think there's a few kind of, flashing lights on the dashboard as well.
Thank you. Let's turn to some audience questions. And there are a few here. There's this interesting question from Irina Nedova. Podcast counts on individual consumption, and are you concerned that it might ruin the idea of common civil space, which in the pre-podcast social media era was the moment of synchronous listening of the news? She gives an example with War of the Worlds, Orson Welles' War of the Worlds broadcast. Do you think that in times of podcasts we will lack the broadcast, or it is completely replaceable? Katy?
Yeah, what an interesting question. I'd never really thought about that before. It's funny, something that I've been watching a lot over the last few months, and I think a lot of people around in different countries have been watching, is politicians giving live broadcasts on Facebook, or statements that are sort of aired live on Facebook. And that was interesting, because to me, that feels like watching television, and it feels more like a communal experience than watching television, because you have people tweeting underneath and commenting on this in live time and live in completely live, and you can feel like you are part of a really live conversation about it. So obviously podcasting is a very individual experience, but there's always been individual experiences of consuming the news. I mean, consuming a newspaper at a quiet moment in your day is a very individual experience. So I don't feel like it has to necessarily ruin or destroy that idea of a common civil space. No, I think it can be complementary.
A question from Nirvana. Aren't podcasts by design biased, since one host or a group of hosts are presenting an item through their prism? I guess this is a question for all of you, but Zornitsa?
Aren't all media biased? I mean, you come from, certain, set of values and principles, or even a statement mission as a media. Like, for example, we believe in the free market economy in our newspaper, and certainly some people with leftist view will be, sometimes feel that we are not fair or anything, but just trying to include more voices in our podcasts. I think it's important to create that balance. This is what Katy mentioned with the answer to the previous question, I think.
And Andrew, what about you? I think you talked a little bit about this, but do you think podcasts are biased? And can you talk a little bit more about the whole concept of objectivity in media?
Well, that is a big issue about which many theses have been written. I mean, I think both of the questioners raise really interesting points. I mean, I do think, this is the thing, we would probably like to see ourselves as podcasters as there's a bit of a moral kind of mission or purpose of people. I think people generally who make podcasts think they're doing good in some way or other, and hope that we are. But I do think it's fair criticism to say that in a sense, and this is just the way the media has gone generally, it does allow everybody to kind of pick their own version of the news, right? And we're no different to that. I mean, if you look at some of the most popular political podcasts, these are not even-handed analytical looks at the news. In a lot of cases, if you look at Pod Save America in the US, for example, I mean, we know exactly where that's coming from, and that's catering to a particular political point of view. So I do think this is just the nature of the way the media has gone, that broadcast in the old-fashioned sense is being replaced by a kind of atomization, right, where you can pick your news channel that reflects the way you think the news should be presented, and you can pick a podcast that does that too. And that does lead into the question of bias. I mean, I would say, every news product, if you like, reflects the experience and analysis, if you like, of the people who make it, and also of the audience that it's catering for. I mean, that's going to affect how it views the issues, what it prioritizes, all of those things. Within that limit, what we certainly try and do, and this is one of the benefits, I think, of having a kind of multiple host format. If you have that kind of panel format, you can at least have people who are from different parts of Europe, and so can reflect partly their personal take on the news, but also reflect partly how it is being reported there. So whether that's in Berlin or in Paris or Central and Eastern Europe, it's never going to be perfect. But I think, and that also helps if you also have kind of co-hosts with kind of different life experience and people who come at things from a certain direction, and you bring them together. Certainly the people that we have on our podcast have quite different backgrounds, but of course, different backgrounds still within a certain spectrum. And so, I would hope that helps broaden the perspective a bit, but I wouldn't claim that it, gives a complete 360-degree view of everything. I don't think, that is quite possible, but, I think we can all take steps to try and make sure we're, opening the aperture as wide as possible.
Mm-hmm. A question from Andre to Katy. Katy, you're the only representative of an independent podcast on the panel. Would you consider selling out to a big news outlet?
Well, are you offering, Andre? If you want to offer me billions of euros for the Europeans, let's talk. It's a funny one, because at the beginning when we set up the podcast, we had really big dreams about going really big, and there were definitely times when I was editing extremely late at night on top of my day job, a very busy reporting day job, trying to make a podcast as a stupid side project, where I was like, oh God, why can't we just get bought out by a massive news organization, and then there'd be a producer and I wouldn't have to do all of this, and it wouldn't be my problem anymore. So that early on in the Europeans journey was, something that we talked about as being, what if this happened? Wouldn't it be amazing? But as time's gone on, that idea is less and less appealing to us, actually. We really like being independent, and the idea of, having to restrain from talking about certain topics because there was some sort of financial interest. I don't know. So we were part of a news organization that had a big sponsorship from, or was carrying lots of advertising from a massive oil company. And that meant that we couldn't talk about the oil company. It's just a completely random example. But this kind of thing, I think, would make us uneasy. So increasingly, we really, really enjoy having the independence and the freedom that comes with being independent, even though it means that we're still really small, but there's good things that come with that.
Well, I guess my last question is, again, to all of you. So once this pandemic is over, what more would you like to see from news podcasts? Is it explainers, investigations, field reporting, etc.? You talked about this a little bit, but again, what more would you like to see from these programs? Andrew, first.
Yeah, I'll just say something briefly in defense, because I see it's come up in questions as well, of sponsorship and things like that. Even if something is sponsored, even if we have advertisers, we have total freedom to cover those companies, to report on them, to talk about topics that they wish we wouldn't talk about. So I don't think that has to be, necessarily an issue. And in terms of what I'd like to see, I guess it goes back to what I was talking about earlier, which is that I would love to see us just get out of our bubbles a bit more, and find out what's been going on out there when we haven't been able to report as we would have liked. And then, I also would love to see more innovation, the kind of stuff that Katy talked about in terms of, trying new things in terms of sound design or storytelling, a more kind of documentary approach, if you like, to podcasts. But I think there'll always still be, value in just a bunch of people that you like listening to, and having the feeling of that kind of intimate sort of conversation with them. So I think that will stay, and I'm fine with that staying. But I'll be interested to hear what comes next. I'm sure there's lots of people, including people watching now, who've got some great ideas.
Zornitsa, what ideas would you work on after this? Again, after the pandemic is over, or what would you like to see from other news shows?
In Bulgaria, it's still pretty young podcasting. So I think we have like many directions to go to, and but I really like to see more field reporting. You really want to like to see the art of conversation, back in our newsrooms and back into journalism. So that's definitely that, and more human-centered stories. I really liked Katy's approach, and I think we are missing that in our media landscape in Bulgaria.
And Katy, what about you? What is sort of the first thing you're going to do after COVID is over?
Oh, wow. That's one question. I guess whatever's possible. I mean, if we had the money, the thing I think is really missing in Europe is these kind of like big blockbuster narrative journalism series that are produced in America, stuff like Serial, stuff like S-Town. But that stuff is incredibly expensive, and it doesn't feel quite like anyone in Europe is willing to put the money into it. I'd love to make it if anyone would like to give us the money, or somebody else should be making it. But I think that's the thing I would love to see from Europe, is this really sort of really deeply reported, extremely expensive and time consuming audio journalism. I'd love to listen to it.
I hope that's going to be possible. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Katy, Andrea, and Zornitsa, for this wonderful discussion. It was an absolute pleasure. And I hope for Katy and Andrea that we can meet here in Bulgaria, hopefully soon. And thank you to all of our audience. Don't forget to join us again tomorrow when we're going to talk about investigative journalism and podcasting with reporters Maeve McClanagan and Paul Caruana Galizia. Same time, same place. It was a pleasure for me to be your host for the past hour. And see you soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.